Coming to you now is Lechem Panim with your host, Pastor Cameron Ury, Senior Pastor and Bible Teacher at Renton Park Chapel in Renton, Washington.
It's good to have you with us today as we continue our study of the book of Esther, beginning chapter 4 today. But before we get into the text, I'd like to share a story of two brothers I once heard of. Both were well known around town for their crooked business dealings and underworld connections. And they were as mean and cold-blooded as you could possibly imagine. But one day, one of the brothers died, and the surviving brother, he wanted to give his dead brother a funeral fit for a king. So he called the funeral home, and he made all the arrangements. And then he called the town's minister and made him an offer, as they say, that he couldn't refuse. He said, "I'll give you $10,000 to put that new roof on the church if, in eulogizing my brother, you call him a saint." And the minister, who is usually known for his integrity, surprisingly agreed. And the whole town turned out for the funeral. And the minister began. He said, "The man you see in the coffin was a vile and debauched individual. He was a liar, a thief, a deceiver, a manipulator, a reprobate, and a hedonist. He destroyed the fortunes, careers, and lives of countless people in this city, some of whom are here today. This man did every dirty, rotten thing you can think of. But, compared to his brother, he was a saint." Now, I don't know what the repercussions of that minister's saying that was, but I imagine the brother was not very happy. One of the key truths we have been learning is you cannot call good what God has condemned. And this is the situation that Mordecai, Queen Esther's cousin, has found himself in. He has been serving as a judge at the king's gate, and King Ahasuerus, he decides to make an evil man by the name of Haman, a descendant of the Amalekites, the ancient enemy of the Jews, his right-hand man. And he commands that all the king's servants who are at the king's gate bow down to him and pay him homage. And Haman, who we see as a slave to vanity, he loves this. He loves having all the royal officials kneel down and pay him honor. But Mordecai refuses to bow down to him, and it wounds his pride and his vanity. And he can't let it go. It's kind of like the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden. Haman already has all the trees that he could ever need. He has the favor of everyone. He has access to the tree of life. He has the favor of the king himself. But it's that one tree that he cannot have, Mordecai, that consumes his mind. And therefore Haman conspires to kill Mordecai. And not just Mordecai, but all the Jews. And he does this by convincing the king, who doesn't know his own wife's people, that the Jews are a threat to the Persian Empire. He says they have different customs from those of all the other people, and that they do not obey the king's laws, by which, of course, he meant Mordecai wouldn't bow to him. And the thrust of Haman's argument is that the Jews will create instability in the empire. And so he asks for permission to have them destroyed. Now, he never tells the king which people they are, but the king nevertheless, amazingly, agrees to this genocide and gives Haman his signet ring to authorize this decree. And the close of chapter 3 is really quite unbelievable. It says, "The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. And the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Susa was thrown into confusion." Recently in our Sunday school class at Renton Park Chapel, our conversation shifted towards a discussion of the events in and surrounding the Holocaust. And we can't even imagine what many of the people of that time had to go through. In a way, it seems almost too far removed from us. But imagine waking up one morning, making breakfast, and as you turn on the news, you hear an announcement that it has been determined that your people are responsible for all the disunity in the country. for the instability in our nation, and for every disastrous choice this country has made. And there's only one solution, a final solution. All your people, including you and your family, are going to be rounded up and systematically exterminated. Now that may sound like a foolish fantasy, but remember, the Holocaust was not really that long ago. That kind of persecution has been a common thread of God's people throughout all of history. And I'm sorry to say it will continue to be until Christ returns. But imagine receiving that news update. What would you do in Mordecai's shoes? You'd probably start calling your family, and at the same time you're getting calls from loved ones, you're all panicking together, and you'd be grieving. It says, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting. And many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. Can you imagine the fear, the terror, that dreadful anticipation of what is to come? I mean, what do you do? In times like that, the only thing you can do is turn to God. Lift up your voice to him and pray for deliverance. And that's what the Jews are doing. It says in verse 4, when Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, meaning about Mordecai, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. And the reason that she sends him the clothes, by the way, is not to try to get him to snap out of whatever it is he's going through. Esther knows that whatever it is very important. She's sending him clothes so that he could then enter into the king's gate and talk with her directly. Because remember that verse 2 tells us no one could enter the king's gate, that official building, clothed in sackcloth. That's Persian law. And I want to mention that to you because Esther isn't discounting his feelings here or his means of expressing them, but is seeking to clothe him so that she can find out as soon as possible what's on his heart. And it says in verses 5 and following, then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction. Then he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. After this, it says in verse 9 and following, and Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without first being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come in to the king these 30 days. You see, Esther is counting the cost, not in an unhealthy way, but in a rational way. She understands her own life is at stake. And verse 12 says, they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Now, it's never wrong to acknowledge the danger in your doing what is right. It's even okay to be afraid. I'm not sure how you could be in Esther's position and not be afraid. But the thing about fear is that it always needs to be taken captive and placed in perspective. And that's what we see Esther doing. She sets priorities and she gets perspective. And Mordecai really helps her with this. It says, then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. Keep in mind, if she's exposed, it doesn't matter who she is. Her life could be in danger because the king is not above the law of the Medes and Persians. She could be killed even despite her royal position. He says, "For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." Now, this really shows that Mordecai has a strong understanding of the providence of God. Haman's death decree was against all Jews in the Persian Empire, and thus it would have included the land of Israel. If his decree had been carried out, all of God's chosen people could have been exterminated, and God's plan to send his son Jesus to earth as a Jew could have been ruined. But God's plans cannot be stopped, and Mordecai recognizes this. But he also recognizes that there are immediate consequences for not following the will of God. Israel did not obey God when told to enter the promised land. They had been too afraid. And God therefore made them to wander the desert for 40 years until that generation died off because of their lack of faith. And Mordecai is afraid that the same thing will happen here. Yes, God can raise up deliverance in another way, but Esther and her own relatives would be lost if she was not courageous enough to take that step of faith and obedience. And Mordecai basically tells her that where she is now, it's not an accident. She has been placed where she is, with the influence that she has been given by God for a purpose. And that purpose, not her life, that purpose is her most important priority. And the same is true of each and every one of us. God has placed us where we are for a purpose. He has given each of us a sphere of influence. Are we going to be faithful to use that influence for his glory? Are we going to be courageous enough to step out and witness to that person? Are we going to be bold enough to stand up for what is right? Are we going to be faithful to meet the needs of those who are oppressed and needy? Are we willing to become unsafe in order to glorify God? That phrase, "for such a time as this," I keep hearing over and over as we go through this COVID-19 crisis. And it makes me think of the needs that are present in our own time. The need for men and women of God to not only talk about holiness, but be the salt and light in the world. God has laid a call upon your life and my life for such a time as this. And the question is, how are we going to respond? It's my hope and prayer that you and I will respond as Esther did, in faith and in courage. And faith and courage, they're choices. They're not feelings. We have to choose to have faith and courage. We have to choose to follow God into the fray, even in the midst of contexts where the temptation is to fear, despair, and fall back. And I want to encourage you today, let us choose to be men and women of faith and courage. Let's do so. Amen.
Today's episode of Lechem Panim has been made possible by Renton Park Chapel, a church that is committed to the ministry of sharing the joy of hearing and doing God's Word, and to the mission of bringing people into the life-giving presence of Jesus Christ in and through vibrant preaching, teaching, Bible study, prayer, and ministry to a world that is in desperate need of the healing touch of Jesus Christ. If you'd like to learn more about our ministry here at Renton Park Chapel, or would like to request any of our messages here on Lechem Panim, you can visit us online at rentonparkchapel.org or lechempanim.org. You can also find us on both Facebook and Twitter. We look forward to hearing from you, and thank you for listening. And may you know all the fullness of having in your life the bread of the presence of God.